Hi, everybody. Um, hi, I'm Leilani Gilpin. I'm an assistant professor at UC Santa Cruz. I'm super excited to be moderating this panel today. We're going to be talking about AI, which some of you may know is quite popular these days. But we're going to be talking about specifically AI, open source, and open scholarship. We have a wonderful panel today. We're going to be talking about, different vantage points, the challenges of artificial intelligence, the opportunities of artificial intelligence, how we can use it for open source, what are the limitations, and open scholarship. And so I'm really excited to welcome our panelists today. I think how I will start the panel, so kind of a run through of how we'll do this. I'll have the panelists introduce themselves. I have kind of a couple questions to motivate their introduction, and then we'll have a moderated discussion, and then we'll leave some time for questions. And I know that this panel is also right before the break, so I'll try and give everyone a break, and they can also speak to the panelists as well. So to get started, I will have each of the panelists introduce themselves and maybe answer kind of a few questions. So how does AI intersect with your work? How are you seeing AI changing things fundamentally, and what excites you and what concerns you?
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Fernando Perez, and I guess I should open by saying that I am the faculty director for BIDS, which is the organization that's kind of hosting the event. And so I want to thank Christy Whitaker and Jared Millman, who had our OSPO, Lily, and the rest of our team for a ton of work that they've done in putting this together. And I hope it's been a productive and successful event. I am here at Berkeley faculty in statistics, and my background is originally in particle physics and applied math, but I actually came to Berkeley because of open source. So I was basically started collaborating with Jared Millman back around 2004 on building open source tools for brain imaging. I had started IPython, what grew eventually into Jupyter in grad school, and that connected me with a team of open source minded neuroscientists at Berkeley, got me my first job here, and eventually was part of the team that started BIDS. And today I'm faculty in stats, and stats is now part of a new college at Berkeley, which is the College of Computing, Data Science and Society, where actually open source is very central to our mission, and it's recognized as such by the dean, by leadership. It was actually part of the letter that went into the creation of the college. As you may or may not know, creating a college in the UC system is a very complicated process, and the creation of tools and the creation of open knowledge was actually central to the letter that created CDSS when it went to the regents of the UC system back in 2023. So AI is kind of woven into everything that we do in CDSS. It really is. Berkeley obviously is home to our EECS department. Both EECS and stats are departments with huge amounts of work in AI. Half of our faculty are on leave for AI-related reasons, because of startups, because of nonprofits, because of various things. I actually co-founded a company with our dean and some of our faculty, including Matej Zaharia, on using AI for material prediction, material properties prediction, which now we just moved to new offices with labs and robots and whatnot here on 4th Street. So it cuts through all of my life. But in building open source communities for 25 years now, IPython, I wrote the first lines of code for IPython in 2001, and had been working on other open source projects before then. I do see AI as creating actually real opportunity, as well as obviously challenges we'll dive into. My position is one of cautious and what I hope is thoughtful optimism, but active optimism in the following sense, and we'll dig later into it because I don't want to take too much time, is that I think it is here, it's not going away, and even though there's a lot of crazy hype, there's dense reality that is actually important to acknowledge. And so what we need to do is ask ourselves, how do we shape it rather than how do we prevent it or stop it, or what? How do we shape the arrival of these technologies into our society in a way that actually serves human needs. We are not going to pretend it doesn't exist. Saying that it's pure hype isn't useful. But I also don't think we need to simply accept all of the narratives that others are presenting about it. And I think this kind of community, intellectually and culturally, has a lot to say on the matter. And so I hope we'll dig into it. So anyway, it's a pleasure meeting you all. I wear lots of hats here on campus, so I won't go through all of them, but everything that I do is sort of connected to open knowledge and open source in Earth and the environment, at BIDS, and in physics and materials. So thanks.
Thank you. I think I'm probably the only person who's a poetry scholar here in terms of my background. So I'm going to just share a little bit about how I got into open source in the first place, and then the project that I'm working on now, and some kind of roadblocks I feel like I've encountered about pushing it towards open source, which I would really like to do. So I was an English professor in the CSU. I now am a writing instructor at UC Davis because I left CSU for family reasons to live in Sacramento. Anyway, so for 10 years before ChatGPT dropped, I was doing research in digital voice studies and performance studies. And in the course of that, because there wasn't a great tool for the kind of work I wanted to do, I did a lot of collaboration in computer science and linguistics and neurobiology of speech perception, and worked with open source models for Forced Aligner, Pitch Tracker, and we have this like beautiful system that is now hosted by Concordia University that was supported initially by a ACLS fellowship for me, and then the National Endowment for the Humanities, and then a SSHRC grant. SSHRC, right? So that went really well, and I really embraced open source, and it just worked perfectly. And all I had to do was hire a couple of students and then a grad student, to manage the interface design, and it's great. Still going. Still do work with that. What I'm doing now is a project called PAIR, which stands for Peer and AI Review plus Reflection. So this is integrated in writing courses across the curriculum. We're working with 3 CSUs, 4 community colleges, and UC Davis. It's a 3-year grant through the California Education Learning Lab. And ultimately, I think that would be about 12,000 students involved. So PAIR involves peer review, which is in the name, partly because we think it's an important time to recenter the human. So students do peer review, and after they have kind of strengthened their rhetorical awareness of a given writing assignment, they get AI feedback that's criteria-driven, and the criteria dictated by the instructor, and then they reflect on both kinds of feedback before they revise. So it's great for building critical AI literacy, all sorts of other things. And we share the tool and curriculum as open educational resources and so on. We are working with a platform called My Essay Feedback, which was started by a math and music instructor from Western Washington. The reason we shifted to that, because originally we were just, doing this with, chatbots in the wild, obviously student privacy, and also because our collaborator is very responsive and we just can control everything in the platform. He would be delighted to put any large language model behind the platform. And I wanted to get away from commercial platforms for costs, privacy, all sorts of reasons. And we're testing, different models at the moment for the next year. But it comes down to computing infrastructure and project maintenance. So I talked to our open source program office, and I talked also to, I don't know if any of you know Vladimir Filkov in computer science at Davis. Anyway, so I already knew some people in computer science, and he was like, yeah, and I have a grad student, if you have some money for him, and he could get this started, and you should just buy NVIDIA DGX Spark, and it'll be fine. And I kind of thought it'll be fine, and then I talked to our IT people in the College of Letters and Science, and he was like, it never goes like that because you need someone to maintain it in the long term, and IT is not going to take that on. So I don't really know where to go from here, but I would, and I know that I think that UC is like considering maybe even some AI infrastructure. So I would just like to, it's just, we do want real-time feedback for quite a few students every term, but it should be possible to do it on a smaller scale with a medium-sized language model. And rather than having to keep paying tokens to, Anthropic or Microsoft or whatever. So that's where I am.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sahiba. I'm a 5th-year PhD student at Berkeley in the Haas School of Business. So I'm going to actually jump right to the questions, but a brief introduction on my open source history is that I've contributed to many projects, and it's part of my dissertation. In one of my papers, I've made an algorithm to detect AI in code open source as well. I love the community. As part of my research, I've gotten very close to many maintainers and homebrew, and I've been thinking a lot about AI in the open source context, and it's driven a lot of my theoretical way of thinking about how AI is going to impact work. So in general, I use AI as a research assistant to do a bit of the stuff that would have been too manual for me to do and think so that I can think about the bigger things in terms of what I'm trying to achieve with my dissertation. The bigger questions I'm really thinking about is like, what does work look like in an AI augmented world? And how does the evaluation of work now shift? And I'll talk a bit more about that during the panel discussion, but I think that the way that we evaluate work is going to be shifting, and I think about it in terms of what technology does to work and how it creates this opacity in what the human is producing versus what the AI is producing. And that creates its own set of challenges. So what I'm concerned about with AI is that people might be humanizing it more than they should be, and I think that in contexts where there's not as much awareness about what the model is actually doing and its capabilities and how it's trained, et cetera, people are perhaps not using it in the way that is beneficial to them, because I know that AI has much to give to every individual, and it has a huge number of benefits, which is actually what excites me about it, is that I think that now people can do things that they might not have been able to do, maybe because of skill or maybe because of time, and I think that it has huge gains for human potential. So I am cautiously optimistic, and I'm hoping to have a more richer discussion about this right now. Thanks.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. I am Tara Hernandez. I am not an academic, though as of this quarter at UC Santa Cruz, I am actually co-teaching as a lecturer for the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at UC Santa Cruz. I'm a Santa Cruz grad from way back. Do have a computer science degree, but until very recently, I have been actively hostile to AI, and I'll touch on that a little bit. My history with open source goes back to the bad old days. I was an employee at Netscape Communications Corporation, though, if you're not aware. Netscape launched Mozilla.org and the creation of the first, what we call enterprise open source license, which is the Mozilla public license, separate from what we had at the time, which was either the GPL or all of the proprietary licenses. From those inauspicious beginnings, because man, that was a chaotic mess back then, things came out of the idea of enterprise open source licenses that led to the creation of the Linux Foundation and the subsequent foundations there. I had some overlap with the Apache Foundation, some early developer tooling back then. And then since then, it's really been, to me, the focus on the logistics of open source, the mechanics of it, how does it intersect? Going back again to the creation of Mozilla.org, we did not have Slack, we did not have Discord, we barely had IRC. So the concept of community and communication was still very nascent. And I think we've solved some of the basic problems, but still now have ongoing problems around how do you organize around this concept. There is also the challenges around open source project maintainership in a realm where people could generate thousands of PRs through poorly designed agents, right? So again, my focus is on, how do you actually create an ecosystem that is sustainable and also ethical. Do not get me started on all of the recent we're firing people because of AI, or all of the billboard you see where you can replace humans with agents, because we'll be here all day. But I do have, I think Fernando referred to cautious optimism. I would say that I am still highly skeptical because there's a lot of open questions that need to be resolved in order for AI, to me, to truly be integrated in a more positive than ambiguous or negative way. AI to me is the third great paradigm shift in high-tech industry, the first being the advent of the World Wide Web and the beginnings of things like e-commerce and the online presence. The second, of course, being cloud computing. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes. And I think that is me for intros.
Great. Wow, I have so many things I want to ask. So I'll get started with a few questions. I think a lot of you had mentioned stakeholders. Sahiba, your research has shown that open source maintainers are already penalizing AI predicted contributions with 30%, with a 31% point higher rejection rate. I know, Fernando, you spent decades thinking about what makes open source community healthy and sustainable. Marit, you talked a lot about the IT challenges, and Tara, you've talked about, you know, a lot of these kind of problems with organization. I'm wondering, what do you guys think about the opacity as a genuine threat to the contribution model? And maybe we can kind of start from Sahiba and take it down the panel.
Yeah, so this is what I'm building my dissertation around, is the fact that, right, I mean, as of now, we think about technology through a productivity lens. So like, what can technology do for us? And I think what we're missing and what's really being highlighted in this new AI augmented world is that what technology is doing in terms of the information that it's hiding when it comes to knowledge work or just any work. And so I'm creating this theoretical framework around technology as creating opacity, and the opacity exactly comes from how much is the human actually doing. And now that AI can create amazing work, we don't really know how much the individual is putting into that work, and that creates a lot of issues in terms of evaluating that work, because work is not often just about quality. It's about signals of how much the person understands it, how much they can contribute to the collaboration, and how much this is like an ongoing relationship. And so in one of my papers, so the pushback against AI code is not because the maintainers hate AI. They are like AI adopters. They're not Luddites. They love the technology. It's just that they're inundated with people submitting low effort work. And they can sort of tell when someone's using AI, even though like this new disclosure policy has just started. Even like years ago, they could tell that someone's using AI. And I think they're just, you know, used to seeing low effort work. But as Tara said, it's now on steroids, and that is actually what's shifting the way that the maintainers are deciding to spend their time on it. And it's more about like, how do you decide what you're actually going to spend your time and attention on? Until now, we haven't really had to doubt that, because we know that the individual is reciprocating how much attention and time the reviewer is spending, but it's like a big question now of like, how much is a human working on versus how much is the AI working on? And I think that this like human challenge is going to be more important than any challenge created by AI, because the bots are like pretty good. But I think that there is this human process in building work that is more important than what is actually being built.
I'll say a little something just about opacity. I think obviously critical human judgment is like essential in whatever realm you're using AI, and because these bots were created for experts to work more efficiently, not for students or novices. I think all of the AI generated code is opaque because there's just too much of it. You know, I was reading something about, you know, some company that used to generate 25,000 lines of code a month, and now they generate 250,000, and they're having trouble keeping up. Like, nobody's actually looking at it. But what, I don't mean they are, but you know, it's a volume challenge. But from my perspective, what I would really like access to, and why I would like an open source model, other than ethical and financial reasons, is the system prompts. So, you know, when you're using AI for feedback on writing in a very, you know, human-centered way to encourage critical assessment of AI output. You know, that incredibly sycophantic version of ChatGPT was pulled pretty quickly, but you really have to tell it a lot, like, do not rewrite anything for the student. Don't rewrite for the student. Don't rewrite for the student. Don't obsess about grammar. Hey, don't obsess about grammar. And, you know, I don't know what's under the hood, and I can't control when a new model is released and what the emphasis is. You know, and that hasn't created huge problems, but it has created some that are just like puzzling. So I don't like not being able to control the underlying system prompting.
Okay. From my perspective, there's some really interesting schools of thought that I've seen emerging. There's a gentleman by the name of Steve Yagi. Some of you may be familiar. He launched he was at Google. He launched a context search engine at Google. Then he went off and was a principal engineer at SourceGraph, which is another context, which also generated AI tooling. And then he quit that and he founded an open source project called Beads and then another open source project called Gastown. And he's been writing some great blogs. They're very entertaining reads if you haven't read them. He's very, as he would say, no executive presence. But he went all in the other direction. You know, he has tens of thousands of contributors. He is completely uninterested in looking at the code, and he's really leaned into this concept of outcome-driven development cycle times. So his Gastown is basically agents, right, is with archetypes and personas. And so he said, I thought the mayor was going to be reviewing all of my code reviews. I'm certainly not going to look at them, but turns out the sheriff is reviewing all of this code. So he's really kind of taken code out of the picture completely. Now, in something like Gastown, which was essentially a personal academic effort, right? It's not driving, that I'm aware of, it's not driving any particular company's output, but he's changed the dynamic in a way that makes sense to him. I think there's an element of, if your project, open source or otherwise, is going to be utilized in such a way where there has to be not only a testability, but accountability. You know, that I think is where a lot of people are looking. How do we have this environment where maybe if we don't know every line of code, but we're accountable for it? That becomes kind of the interesting aspect. And some of you may be aware there were huge discussions in the EU where, you know, they're saying open source project maintainers are going to be held personally accountable for failures. And, you know, and the Linux Foundation leaned in really hard on that, thank God, along with others, to say you cannot do that unless you want to eliminate all technology in the European continent, right? So I think there's this really interesting element of concerns. You know, the Venn diagram is fifth dimensional, right? And so, you know, one of the things that I think might be interesting within forums like this is to try and tease apart how can we create paths, you know, depending on the outcomes that are critical, what are the right paths that would allow us to get us there the most safely and testably.
Yeah, I love that you brought up the Gastown example, because I think it's actually very valuable as a thought point in the spectrum. It's kind of the asymptotic limit of taking this to the extreme and seeing what happens there. And I think those things are useful for understanding a little bit of the landscape where we're thinking. My take on this is that it does go to accountability is one of those points, and responsibility, but I'm using that, I think they're not the only ones, because to me it is about what is the role and value of the humans in here, and can we try to for a second pause on some of the negative reactions, and I have them too, I think we all do, and we have the right to feel those, to have those feelings, is that there's aspects of this that feel like attacks almost on our identity. My identity is that I write code. If this thing is going to be the one writing the code, then who am I, right? And that is an issue, and we shouldn't dismiss it. I'm not trying to shove that under the rug, but there have been transitions. I've written huge amounts of C, C++, and low-level code, and then shift to Python and other high-level languages. I do not know how to read assembly, right? I'm not capable of debugging a compiler-level bug. I've written tons of numerical code. If there's a bug in the compiler, I do not know how to dig into the assembly to understand where it's coming from. A few of my scientific colleagues have that ability. Very few do, right? Are we entering a point of transition where the level at which we operate isn't anymore, and maybe Python is just, or R, or these high-level languages become just the reference spec, and these tools are re-implementing in Go, in Fortran, in whatever as appropriate? I don't know, but my point is we should try to decouple the identity that we have in some specific aspects of the task from the role we have as a community, because that is what I don't want to see happening, right? What I don't want to see is the AI tools showing up like wrecking balls through these communities, right, and destroying the human fabric. Because the human fabric of the maintainers takes a long time to build. That human community is the one that encodes in its culture, in its practices. It happens to be kind of encoded in the software artifacts, but maybe that is going to change. But the software artifacts happened to be the place that encoded the knowledge because they were hard to maintain. Because writing code was one character at a time on your keyboard, maybe a few at a time with the tab completion key. Now it may be tens of thousands of lines at a time. So what is the part where we do the human work? And can we ask questions like, oh, maybe the problem that we had that we have complained about, of not enough contributions and non-code contributions not being valued, and the high barrier of entry to open source because you have to be a very good software developer, maybe those barriers getting lowered is a good thing for our communities. Maybe we can communicate at the level of the problem we're solving, whether it's analysis of an image from a microscope or the development of a statistical algorithm. And if we can communicate at the level of the science we're trying to do and the decisions we want to make based on that science, then the machines can assist us in bridging the gap between those who know how to write Fortran and those who know how to write R and those who know how to write Julia, right? And so what I hope we can do is build practices and policies and be creative and experiment and understand that we will make mistakes, to ask how at each part of the processes that we had, can the AI be helpful in ways that do not harm the team, the community, and if we are willing to accept that maybe some tasks we used to do will be different. Because I think pretending that we're going to be writing every single line of Python by hand for the next 20 years is just not a tenable position. It's not a helpful position, because instead we will get bulldozed by the versions of Gastown that come into this. I think Gastown is interesting as an intellectual exercise. I'm not saying we should use the Gastown model to run an open source community, right? But it is helpful to see that asymptotic limit. So that's kind of where I am.
Can I just do one quick plus on that? I think, thinking back to what I was saying earlier and also hearing what Marit was working on, if we think about, when I first got into high-tech industries back in the 90s, the first couple of companies that I worked at, the ultimate output of our effort, the thing that we made money on, was something that existed on a floppy disk. And then I got really excited when it was on a CD-ROM, so we could have just one as opposed to 50 floppy disks. You haven't lived until you've been over and over again. But in the advent of the internet as sort of the common usage, right? Instead of just being able to write a program that you could run on your computer, now you have to write a program that understands network, right? And with cloud, and then you had systems engineers that would help you do the load balancing and the operations management, whatever. But now there's cloud. So now you have to understand networking and security protocols and billing accounts and role management, right? And so, as the AI skeptic, I'm still firmly on the not beloved category yet, but I do see an opportunity to also allow focus, right? I think the fact that, computer science exiters, I think Berkeley reported a 50% drop in the major, which is interesting. We'll see how long that lasts. But to be able to actually have focus, because you don't have to worry about what, as an industry, we've been requiring you to increasingly worry about. We've been adding to the cognitive load. I think there is an opportunity to reduce the cognitive load, but it doesn't mean that the cognitive load doesn't have to be filled somewhere, and I think that's what you were alluding to, right? So a system, I think, that would allow us to say, okay, I'm still a network person, but maybe instead of manually manipulating the routing tables in the Juniper network device, I have a skill that I can give to cloud users, or I maintain plus cursor codecs, whatever, right? So I think there is an interesting opportunity there. Now, as humans, whether or not we'll lean into it in healthy ways remains to be seen. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe let's dig a little bit more into that opportunity. We were talking about how AI is changing who gets to participate in open source. Fernando, you mentioned there used to be this high barrier, and now we have kind of a lower technical barrier to contribution, but of course this might erode trust, which many of you mentioned. So I'm wondering, maybe again, we can go through the panel. Do you think, with AI, is this a net gain or a net loss for open source? And who does this affect?
Should I start?
Go ahead.
Okay, so just hearing what everyone's saying, I think that an ideal world would be that, the AI comes and then we have inequality goes down and who can contribute. But the AI is also being used by the maintainers as much as it's being used by the newcomers. And there is this group of new people that come into open source that submit AI slop. And the negatives of a small group of people submitting a ton of AI slop kind of just takes over any positives that newcomers could bring to the repositories. And so what I'm seeing is that instead of now being more welcoming to newcomers because you think that inequality would reduce because you reduce the barriers to entry, maintainers actually rely more on other signals, because now submitting a pull request is no longer a signal of accountability or commitment or effort. And so I think it's actually having the opposite effect in the real world. And I've also noticed that, and this is part of the analyses that I'm trying to do to understand where the community should move from here, is that there's this new norm of adding disclosures to pull requests, which is that every time you submit a pull request, amongst the different things that you have to check off that you've done in the pull request, there's also, did I use AI? Or sometimes it's, did I use AI to like do X, Y, Z, and then explain what you did. People don't disclose. And so this is really not solving any problem. In the data that I've looked at, less than 1% of people disclose. And what it's actually doing is that now it's making this pressure to like really look at every pull request to see whether people are disclosing or not much higher. I've seen a lot more people now get banned from open source projects. It's mostly the newcomers that don't have prior reputation. And these newcomers are not even disclosing AI. The maintainers just think that they're submitting AI code. And so I think that ideally in our like amazing world, it would reduce inequality, but I'm actually seeing that now a newcomer has to do much more than they would have had to do in a pre-AI world to actually prove to the maintainers that they are going to be contributing in a positive way, because maintainers also are like humans and they have limited time, and they themselves can use the AI oftentimes to do the work that the newcomers might have wanted to do. So it's sort of like this nice collaborative process of open source is getting disrupted by AI more than it is actually being helped by it right now.
I don't think I'm the best person to answer that question, but I wanted to raise some things that I would like to hear everybody else comment on more. I think that, open AI, which is not open source anymore, like initially they were promising, oh, it's the triumph of open source, like everybody can have everything. And China and the US are taking very different approaches that way. But the last time, as a global research community, we stopped sharing, things on open science model was the lead up to the hydrogen bomb. And then there's like mythos. So I don't know. I think we're just on different kind of national tracks. I mean, I think it's democratizing access to code and to the ability to generate code. But, the acknowledgement thing is the same kind of thing in writing. Like, people are not always very frank, and we're trying to develop policies. Like, you're supposed to very specifically explain how you used AI or what you told the agent to do. I feel like coding communities are maybe a little ahead on this, because I feel like they were trying to impose coding culture or software development culture on cultures of writing, which are very different. But, Stack Overflow like immediately banned AI generated text, and then they're like, okay, AI generated text is okay, but a human moderator needs to check it first. And I don't know where they are now. So those are just some maybe
Going out of
thoughts
business.
that are relevant.
I think GitHub has also allowed maintainers to now completely ban pull requests. And so maintainers now no longer have to accept public pull requests. And so just a testament to how this is like not actually helping people, but we thought it would.
I would kind of, the word, is it a net positive or a net negative, is a question at any moment in time. That's a time running tally, and that hopefully, so we have evidence of these problems that Sahiba's work is kind of flagging, and those are very concerning, right? Because there are kind of various examples and forms of this kind of effect of pulling the lower rungs of the ladder out, right? Which we've seen is like, well, these tools in the hands of great experts can accelerate the experts, but how do they help everyone else get to that? Kirsty and some of us were last week at a conference at UCSF from our computational precision health program that is joined between Berkeley and UCSF, and Robert Wachter, who's doing a lot of work on AI in medicine, gave a keynote, and he actually presented a really concerning example, which was a controlled experiment that was done on gastroenterologists who analyze colonoscopy images looking for precancerous lesions, and how it's not about novices learning or not learning because of AI. They took experts, right? And then they gave them an AI-assisted tool that helps them more rapidly speed up the analysis, basically their equivalent of looking at a pull request, right? Looking at these things, they let them use the AI tool for 3 months. Then they took the AI tool away from them and they put them back into their non-AI assisted workflow. These are medical professionals with decades of experience, massive measurable loss in performance, right, of your expert medical who will look at your colonoscopy after 3 months of using these tools, right? That happens to all of us. And so I think our challenge to hopefully have an answer that net, if we measure it maybe 6 months or a year or two from now, is how do we create those processes for those newcomers to still find a path? Right now, there's a sense of a bit of a war, right? The newcomers are showing up with AI slop everywhere. The maintainers feel flooded. I don't want to be drinking from a fire hose of crap, so I'm just going to close the gates. Fully closing the gate of saying, like, no PRs is kind of the end point of saying just literally like close the gate, right? That is the ultimate defense, like build the moat, lift the bridge, and live in the castle. That isn't a useful long-term solution, right? And so we do need to ask, what was the job of maintainers trying to tag good first issue, have a good contributing guide, have a good welcoming cafe for the project? Well, what are the versions of that we need to build so that newcomers understand what does it mean? What you need to do is not get a pull request through by sending more and more stuff. What you need to do is learn how the community works to build trust with them so that you can be in the human decision-making part of the process. Well, what are those rungs? What does the new ladder look like so that people can climb it when that ladder is going to have AI in there? Because if 99% of the code isn't getting disclosed, then the disclosure tick box is freaking useless. Let's not have it. Let's assume there's always AI and then build processes that are helpful. But the ladder is going to have to look different when it's going to be climbed with AI along the way. And pretending that it isn't there isn't helpful.
So I think that, yeah, 100%. I think that there's added elements, right? So we talk about AI slop from a maybe well-intentioned or overly enthusiastic person. That's actually, to me, not even the biggest problem. The problem is active hostile threat actors, right? I mean, we can think about, off the top of my head, I can probably think 5 or 6 in the last year, easily, right? So now we have the expert who is using AI to enhance their expertness in malicious activity. So that's a challenge. And I think that unfortunately, any open source maintainer has to consider that, because even if you lock it down, what happens? We fork, right? So if you're an open source maintainer that tries to lock things down in order to keep your environment clean, eventually someone will fork it, and we've seen this happen as well. In very entertaining ways and less entertaining ways. And so then now you have a proliferation of like things, and you lose the ability to drive the community that you want because you've created a barrier of entry that's so hard they're more willing to try this other one, maybe not realizing that there's a threat actor behind them or just an idiot. We're human. So I think from that perspective, it does come back to the human element as a critical part of this because of the curation, right? And what you said about the gastroenterology thing, I can believe. I'm starting to see a lot of studies coming out and blogs being written about AI is actively making us dumber, right? Hands down. There is an element of learning, and I'm a great example of that. I learn the best when I try something and fail. But if I do become too reliant on it, I'm introducing a future problem for myself, and I think that's a challenge that we all have to face, which is the balance, right? But as the human condition, there's a poet here, so she can speak to this. The human condition will tend to try to find the easiest path instinctively, where I think we're physiologically, biologically inclined to do that. And so the easiest path is going to lead us astray until we figure out how to make another path feel as easy that takes us in the right direction.
Great. So I'm hearing a lot about kind of how we learn. And so maybe I want to shift the discussion a little bit to thinking about education. Marit, I was thinking about your collaborative project. It's shifted from not-for-profit platform to protect student privacy and ease data collection. But what does this mean for reproducibility? And maybe we can bring that to a larger discussion. What does this kind of opaqueness mean, both for the project you're working on, but also the whole panel?
Sure, and sorry, it's Marit, but
Marit,
no,
excuse
everybody
me.
does that, no worries. So we actually started using PAIR in, just with any chatbot, but we would give students guidance on privacy protections first. And then shifted to this not-for-profit platform. So, and that's just, so I should say that the PAIR model, which is basically very carefully developed feedback prompts on writing, and then with additional criteria that instructors develop, right? And it's very good at making you make your rhetorical situation more explicit, because to get useful feedback, you have to really tell it that rhetorical context. So that, can be used, that model can be used with any chatbot. It's just that we wanted to study, how are the students reflecting about peer versus AI feedback. We were thrilled that they come out of this preferring the combination of peer and AI feedback. A small but significant minority, a large significant minority prefer peer feedback only after coming out of that. A very small percentage only want AI feedback, and sometimes that seems to be just anecdotally for emotional reasons, like they're nervous about sharing their work. I would just come back to what I said about system prompts, that you can use this feedback prompt and like your explicit criteria with any chatbot, but you may get different results, and so much of it depends on how well you understand your rhetorical context. So I would say that that's a very specific context about trying to teach students to write, but I think teaching students to write is teaching them to think. And we are going to have to find ways to preserve struggle and challenge, because we're at a very particular point where, if you're in your early 50s like me, I grew up without access to these. So I have a pretty high level of expertise as a writer, and they don't help me very much. Like I try, and it was like, nope, shitty. And I just, so I do my editing myself, but if you're 20 or 15 or 10, so I just think the way that we are interacting with AI is not the way our students are interacting with AI when they don't have the same level of expertise. I'll share one analogy, and it's not about like how it's going to change human nature, but it's helpful to think historically. Dennis C. Tenen, who is a former Microsoft programmer of some sort, who's now an English professor at Columbia, wrote a book that I have a lot of problems with called Literary Theory for Robots. But one thing I appreciated him mentioning is that when the printing press was invented, it put a lot of scribes out of work, right? And he doesn't quite connect these other dots, but what it did was like raise the level of expertise. So you could no longer, when more and more people are literate, you could no longer, make a living explaining texts to people because they could read them themselves. So ironically, the computer science majors, like we still need, but they need to enter the job market with a higher level of expertise. Because we're all curators and editors instead of doing all the primary writing of code or prose ourselves.
I think I want a very quick note back to a question you asked earlier about the infrastructure, that in case you or others are not aware of it, there is a really great resource that is publicly funded, federally funded, which is the National Research Platform. NRP is accessible to almost anyone with kind of an academic affiliation, and they do offer multiple models that are hosted, and that team has done a really good job of exposing models as a service for academic usage. And so that is something that may be worth looking into. And I know there's multiple people in the audience who work extensively with NRP, so if it's helpful, that's something to kind of keep in mind. But kind of back to this question of learning and struggle, that to me, the argument has always been made by economists that every new technology disrupts one layer. You kind of encode that and encapsulate it in semi or fully automated systems, and then humans move up to the next one. I think what makes this particular moment so challenging is that, in a sense, we do have now a universal machine, right? With universal kind of abilities to some extent, of different degrees of quality and so forth. But yeah, Opus 4.7 is pretty freaking impressive, no matter what you ask it. And so we shouldn't dismiss that. And because the interface to this new machine is natural language, right, which is the skill that most humans after a few years of life do have, that does change the game, right? Because it does change exactly, okay, how do we create that necessary process where struggle and failure is what makes our brain, like the synapses get wired up because of the repetitive process of failure and attempted retries and so on. How do we create that, which is a difficult thing and not always pleasant in the moment. It's kind of pleasant after the fact when you have the satisfaction of having learned, but the struggle is hard. I don't know if I would have stayed up in grad school until 3 in the morning struggling with nasty electrodynamics problems and quantum mechanics problems if I could have gone to bed 3 hours earlier and the thing had helped me. But that is what made my brain. So I don't have an answer, but we do need to encode a way for that struggle that makes our brains what they are as machines, that wet machines that give us meaning and joy in life, still function, because I don't want to be the floating thing on the Wall-E movie with like the screens in front of that is not the life I want to live and the life I want my child to grow into. So I don't know.
As someone who worked on that movie, I'm glad that you got the right. I said, as someone who worked on that movie, I'm glad you got the right takeaway.
Oh, you did? Wonderful. It's one of my favorite.
So maybe we have time for maybe a couple quick questions. Oh boy.
Oh my goodness.
And we'll also take questions during the break. I guess I'll go with the,
Are we sending a mic or?
let me try and.
Okay.
Oh,
We can share 1 or 2 mics here.
So I want to ask a question with the influence arrow in the panel going in the other direction. Instead of the influence of AI on openness, I'm interested in the influence of openness on AI. So the people represented in this group potentially influence the entire state of California. And there's an initiative called Cal Compute that has the potential to make open infrastructure available to provide public work. Dirk Riel yesterday asked a really spicy question. Where is the open foundation model that can stand in competition with the other foundation models? This community seems to me to be poised with the right coherence to actually influence this at scale. Where can we get that momentum?
I don't know that I have the answer to that, but in my experience, thank you. A foundation, what you're really talking about is, a foundation that can provide oversight, right, or something like that. And what I have seen is it comes from 2 places. It either comes from government regulation, which is inevitably probably 10 years behind where you'd like it to be. Note the AI regulation out of the EU, for example. Or it comes from, frankly, capitalistic, selfish endeavors. So the Linux Foundation, which is arguably one of the most powerful open source foundations in the world, exists because there were companies that wanted to break the proprietary control of Unix licenses away from companies like Hewlett Packard and Digital Electronics, et cetera, right? So there was a non-benefit of the human world, I forget the term for that, motivator, right, that has, I think, thank God it exists, because I think it has been a critical part of the evolution of industry in many ways. I think industry would be a much darker place right now without that concept of open source and of enterprise supported open source. So this is a non-answer. To answer your question, I think we need to figure out one of 2 things. One, how to get the right people involved for a government-sponsored, which is a challenging proposition, or we figure out the right messaging to motivate industry to fund this so that industry sees that this is a good idea and this is possible. One area that could help there is increasingly there is hostility to AI, not just because AI is taking jobs, rightly or wrongly, but because AI is driving data centers, that's taking water and land and all of those other things. And the best answer I've seen is, oh, well, we're going to make data centers in low Earth orbit powered by the sun, right? That was, you did ever read that? So, on the other hand, if there are people like, actually, we're going to make new chips that take 1/10 of the energy consumption, and boy, wouldn't it be amazing if these software-based things went along with that, maybe that's a way. But basically, we need to appeal to our inherent human sort of self-interest, and thus our industry self-interest to know this is a good thing.
I
realize
want
that's
to say a
really
couple
cynical,
things,
but
indexing
please.
on what Tara said. So I think right now, partly because of the hype, partly because of the impressive performance in some areas of the frontier models, I think there's too much indexing on the capabilities of the frontier models, and there's plenty we can do without necessarily asking who can compete with the billions of dollars that Anthropic is burning and the 2 or 3 mega frontier labs are burning. I don't think we need to win only that one race to address this problem. And I think focusing on how do we get $100 billion to fight Anthropic isn't right now the most useful question, because I do think we have evidence of areas. As a very concrete example, Jupyter moved under the Linux Foundation in 2024. We created the Jupyter Foundation. Some of the founding premier members of the Jupyter Foundation were AWS, Apple, Bloomberg. And right now, the core layer for AI in Jupyter, which is kind of a vendor-neutral, model-neutral set of APIs and tools and interfaces between workflows in Jupyter and whatever models you want to put behind them, whether it's Claude or anything local, have been largely developed by some community maintainers, but mostly a team at AWS, a team at Apple, and a team at Bloomberg, right? Why? Because they want to get together, and they have a vested interest in building tools together with the community, right? For us to have access to other options, and that coupled with potentially a combination of frontier and local models can go a long way. Just yesterday, my colleague Carl Bödiger, who works on NRP and has some amazing demos on NRP, gave a lovely talk in our environmental data science center on the work he's doing combining the large models and local models to really have much more privately controlled scientific workflows that are tuned for specific scientific problems. Because the frontier models, they're God machines, right? They are the magical Batmobile that can fly, go underwater, and go on the road. Absurdly expensive things. If you need to fly for a little bit, cross a lake, and then drive for a few dozens of miles, you can do that on a budget buying things of under $50,000. You buy a used Toyota Corolla, a small boat with an outboard motor, and a Cessna 172, and buying them costs you $30,000 total, right? A machine that can do all three at the same time at the push of a button, which is what the frontier models are called, things you can ask them about string theory, about fixing your shoes, and about a recipe for tonight, and about medical advice. That is the Batmobile that is borderline science fiction. We don't need the Batmobile to go get groceries, right? And a lot of what we do is task specific that can be done on shared infrastructure, on local systems with open tools. And that is an effort that also has economic benefits for many people who are not Sam Altman or Elon Musk, right? And so there is a way for these communities to actively push in documenting that, building better tools, sharing these lessons, making it a one-click option that can engage these mega monopolies in a productive way. So I don't think that battle is necessarily lost, even if the pure frontier race is not, even if we don't have the $100 billion to win the frontier race.
They're not building the giant frontier models, but they are building truly open, like open data, open everything. Truly open source models are coming out of Hugging Face and out of the Allen Institute. I would look at both of those models. I work at Red Hat, full disclosure. So we had a little bit to do with CNCF, and
Yes, you did.
I'm the PyTorch representative from Red Hat. So we're pushing that we're trying to push that boundary right now as well in terms of open source. We do everything.
The Allen is a key ally in this regard, and I've been talking to them specifically about that.
Okay.
Yeah, they're absolutely a key ally in this space. They have some of the best, and the Swiss Open Science Center has an amazing model called Apertus, which is a large, fully open, multilingual model. So there is an opportunity for the scientific and academic community to have a voice in here. This is not throw your arms up and give up.
No, agreed. I think from an industry perspective and caring about the academic development, I think the thing that I am most concerned with in that perspective is that we have classes, right? There is the crazy class, which is the OpenAI Anthropic, and then there's everybody else. And if we want to avoid a really gross emerging disparity between those two areas, bridging those back together, I think is, from a sort of we all live in this world is a really important thing to keep an eye on.
Great. So I think let's stop the panel now. We're heading into the break, so you can come up and ask the panelists questions. Let's give our panelists a big round of applause.